So the last one is a workshop entitled Old Histories, New Geographies, Contrapuntal Mobilities of Trade and State Across Asia. And this is a workshop that was organized in Singapore in 2010, and Professor Engseng Ho from Duke University.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you all for being here. As Helen says, the workshop was in 2010 in Singapore, and it was called Old Histories, New Geographies. And we could never decide nor remember whether it was Old Histories, New Geographies or Old Geographies, New Histories. But in any case, it doesn't really matter. The idea was to mix up long time periods and broad spaces. And as I speak, you will see why the initial remit was to actually be so broad in space and time. So let me just start off by giving you an idea of the initial remit, the chart sheet, which my co-director Lakshmi Subramanian and myself came up with. So let me just read a bit from the original chart sheet. InterAsian Connections New and Old, a dialogue. Why are we interested in inter-Asian connections rather than global ones? Historically, colonialism reoriented Asian countries towards European masters away from their Asian neighbors. After independence, political initiatives to reconnect Asian neighbors, such as the Bandung Conference non-aligned movement, proved rather unsuccessful. Since the 1980s, however, the deregulation of international commerce and the collapse of Cold War boundaries have expanded the intensity and diversity of exchanges, allowing Asians to cultivate new exchanges far beyond their national borders. Our workshop on Old Histories, New Geographies plumbs the historical resonances that lend excitement, confidence, and trepidation to these new exchanges with old acquaintances across Europe. We seek dialogue between histories of past connections and research on contemporary ones that are recreating the shape of Asia anew. The new geographies of placemaking and ocean crossing we are interested in do not sit well under the sign of globalization, that banner of the recently discredited Washington Consensus. Between the narrow extremes of liberal free trade and gunboat diplomacy, Asian merchants and states are opening up a new space of engagement, building on mutualities of trust, knowledge, and recognition. The concrete social shapes of these mutualities and the exchanges they facilitate seldom correspond to globalization's classic liberal postulates. So a lot of the work in the West on globalization, which has basically been geographically ignorant or naive, perhaps willfully so, I think have not gained a lot of traction in terms of getting deep into the historical dimensions, as well as what are the prime factors in the dynamic movement of these, this sort of reshaping of social space. So this workshop was aimed to convene participants who have researched these social spaces, and often from odd places and not the usual kinds of universities which show up in these kinds of international conferences. Now the migrations, so something of the context why we felt it was timely to do this. The migrations and flows of people have in the past, as they do now, tended to destabilize categories and realities of governance and identity. States often lag behind their mobile citizens. So labor exporting Philippines, India, and Indonesia are challenged in constructing intergovernmental labor regulations with their counterparts in Saudi Arabia, the Persian Gulf, Malaysia, Singapore. Chip foundry manufacturers in Taiwan have completely relocated to the PRC despite a lack of diplomatic and legal protections between their governments. In other ways, states, however, are being entrepreneurial ahead of their populations. In 2006, the newly enthroned Saudi King Abdullah, together with businessmen and businesswomen in tow, visited China, India, Malaysia, Pakistan, before going to Washington. This was a sharp departure from custom. Normally, the new Saudi king goes to Washington first. So this is something new, 2006. In 2007, the foreign minister of Singapore visited Yemen for the first time in history with businessmen and Singaporean members of the Yemeni diaspora, old diaspora, 500-year diaspora in tow. New places such as Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Doha are being built with material redolent of Britain's Asian empire. You think about it, Arab princes, high-priced English consultants, Adenese accountants, lots of Indian Muslim coolies, and Malaysian contractors. This looks a lot like what the British Empire was in the past. Revivified all associations is a lot of what is going on. In China, you have lineage temples bringing together clansmen who are Communist Party officials, local landholders, and overseas Chinese investors to transform paddy fields into export zones. In a similar way, halal hubs and Islamic bonds develop in Malaysia expand religious ties to the Middle East into food and finance. So what we have is all these new dynamic things happening, and we, as scholars, felt we were very much behind the curve on how to understand it. And I had the instinct that we actually have to go back to history to generate concepts which are, in a way, indigenous to not local spaces, but trans-regional spaces. Asia as trans-regional spaces. I thought if you go back to history, you can use history as a conceptual resource to actually extract concepts from history to understand the dynamics of what's going on today. Let me give you a quick overview of the people who participated in the places, what they worked on. We had Armijo working on Gulf China, surveying new connections between what used to be Basra, Canton, today Dubai and Canton. So this started us off on a wide geography. We had Shambaya from Kyrgyzstan, who did a small section of the Silk Route. Kyrgyzstan had its long-distance trading function curbed under Soviet socialism, but once cut loose from the Soviet, it began to parlay the advantage of being Trans-Eurasian Customs Union on the one side and WTO free trade membership shared with China on the other side to essentially become a Chinese backdoor into the Eurasian bloc. So this is a very good example of the very old revivified under new conditions of post-socialism. We had another paper, Karim, on the Asian highway in Bangladesh. Basically, he was talking about China's new land-to-sea routes going from China down to Bangladesh. And in this movement, China going to Bangladesh is a new sort of Asian highway along land, not sea. It becomes problematic with India feeling trapped by China on two sides. There's a lot of enthusiasm in Bangladesh for this new Asian highway to run through them from China to Chittagong. However, you have some people such as Maoists, Wahhabis, and separatists, all in Bangladesh, who may or may not be so happy about this infrastructure. You have a witch's brew happening place amid this optimism. So these three papers were the first section of this workshop. And if you think about it, this was 2010. Within 4 years, 2014, President Xi Jinping of China announced his new Silk Road initiative, starting with an announcement in Kazakhstan, I believe, 2014, and then soon after in Jakarta. So in a way, when Xi Jinping came up with the Silk Road concept, thinking of this Gulf-China relations, Kyrgyzstan, Central Asia, and Bangladesh, it seems to me that what seemed in 2010 to be a hodgepodge of various more or less connected in the past or present, thin connections, suddenly these thin silk routes suddenly became firmed up as steel pipelines, as tar metal roads, and so on. So this is very interesting. Actually. Interesting development after 4 years after our workshop. The second session. The first session had demonstrated then that optimism over ever-increasing globalization in an Asian mode is often misplaced. So because it is misplaced, we actually have to go back to the past to see whether there were also problems rising initially out of too much mobility. too much mobility. So the second set of papers had to do with controlling mobility, regulation. So we had Simon Layton on piracy, how the Brits tried to control Asians moving around and in fact to restrict their movement. We had Lim showing how Chinese merchants and their trade between China and Southeast Asia over time came to be controlled by various colonial states and post-colonial states between Southeast Asia and China. We had Max Hirsch on airports showing how such controls on mobility continue today in the very micro-architecture of airports, as in the greater Pearl River Basin, such that passenger classes are channeled through different categories of rich, poor, citizens, non-Chinese citizens, and so on, along different paths, but within very close quarters. The third session, so the first session was about these long routes. Second session was about people and states moving through these routes. The third session essentially was about being in two places at once, people stuck at one end of the terminal or the other, or saint families who can straddle both. So here we have, for example, Chakravarti on Chungking mansions in Hong Kong, people who have outlived their visa time and are selling cell phones and things like that in this place called Chungking mansions in Hong Kong, where you can get all kinds of dual voltage things and so on. But people who are stuck in between, they are trying to get a leg up to the west. Hong Kong is a place they can go to. They want to probably go to New York next, but somehow they're stuck in that place. We had Nisha Matthew on smuggling of gold between Malabar and the Gulf. And it was a very interesting paper on how the rise of a place like Dubai itself is connected to the breakup of the British Empire, when the British Empire especially the Indian Empire, when India became independent, it essentially made import of gold illegal into India, and Dubai rose as a big smuggling center for gold into India. So the rise of new states, the breakup of empires, but yet the continuity of trade and diasporic merchants, this sort of dynamic was able to explain the rise of some place like Dubai. So this gives you a sense of the papers. So the papers in the first session essentially examine China-West Asia connections. And I've said that this was 4 years before the Xi Jinping's New Silk Road initiative, the announcement of it. So that was one thing. The other thing is that if the rise of China is a major coordinate in the reconfiguration of Asia today, then we have to think of the dynamics of mobility, migration, and their regulation, which pose problematic issues that need fresh theorization. So one of the big interests for our group was coming up with new concepts geared to these actual historical and contemporary dynamics. In the third session, we had, as I've said, people stuck between one boat or another, these liminal regions of transit, focusing on individuals, families, and enterprises that straddle two ends of routes or that inhabit hubs. You may have seen this movie of an, I think, Iranian who was in the airport in Paris, and his visa ran out, his passport ran out. He ended up living in the airport for years. So stuck in transit, basically. You have people like that stuck in transit. Finally, let me try to describe for you or discuss with you some of the concepts which came out of this rather nebulous and loose set of papers. Geographically, our papers went from Istanbul in the west to Shanghai in the east, with lots of side trips in between to Dubai and places like that. The new connections which are blowing across Asia are taking place on the back of more recent developments. So what are these recent developments? I would put them under the umbrella of the post-Cold War world. What you have is basically two sets of deregulations. You have, firstly, a dramatic deregulation of finance and trade, starting with what was called Big Bang in London. This deregulation has fueled a huge boom in international commerce. It has also ended in tears with a great bust 2008-2009 financial crisis. Nevertheless, the legal and logistical infrastructures which have mushroomed in this period stand ready to underwrite many more booms as well as busts. Secondly, the end of the Cold War has led to the liberation of peoples who were virtually imprisoned in national or Cold War borders and has fueled a large boom in travel along all axes of the world. Now, I carry a Malaysian passport. I couldn't, before all this, travel to China or South Yemen because those were communist countries. So these two factors, the deregulation of international finance and trade and the deregulation of political borders, being the collapse of Cold War borders, have acted in synergy, fueling the rise of budget airlines, internet, cheap phone calls, enabling the common people to take advantage of new opportunities for mobility. So, first major concept that comes out of our workshop is the idea of mobility. Mobility is an important concept. After mobility, the deregulation of international finance, trade, and border controls was also part of another deregulation in the domestic sphere. In most countries, capitalist or communist, you had the wholesale transfer of public assets and obligations from the public to the private sphere. Think of Reagan and Thatcher on the one side, privatization across the board, Gorbachev and Deng Xiaoping going from communist to capitalist. So same process of privatization from public to private. Now for our purposes, this deregulation of the domestic sphere had the major consequence of loosening or in fact dissolving the social compact that existed between state and citizen. In the US and UK, affordable education is no longer a right. In Cambridge, I think fees were raised by 90% within 1 year. In China and Japan, the iron rice bowl or iron salary has been broken. The new nations, which became the dominant political form in the past 50, 60 years, shared to a large degree this social compact. Being a citizen of a state meant you could get most of what you needed in one place: employment, education, healthcare, transport, family life, the basic requirements of social reproduction. Citizenship was a unified bundle of rights and obligations. Now, this social compact was broken with these double deregulations. Citizenship was unbundled. The unbundling of citizenship brought about by deregulation, domestic, and privatization meant that many people now have to go abroad to seek things they need but cannot get at home. So while international deregulation allowed new mobilities, domestic deregulation in many cases requires new mobilities. Many families across the world cannot not have a family member earning hard currency abroad. So if you think of it this way, this simple fact of loss of private purchasing power, public safety, public services, and safety nets fuels many diasporas which have appeared across Asia and elsewhere. Now, a year after our workshop, you also had something else, the Arab Spring, starting, if you remember, with the Tunisian fruit seller burning himself. And this precisely is this issue of unbundling of citizenship, this breaking of the social compact with the double deregulation. And since then, Tunisia, Egypt, Bahrain, Yemen, Syria, this whole unbundling has actually led to the collapse of the national developmentalist state. So the concepts which we were playing with in the workshop actually start to give you traction when you have these new developments, the Chinese Silk Road, the Arab Spring, and so on. I think time is short. I'll just skip to the end to say that, so concepts we came up with, such as mobility, the unbundling of citizenship, and one which I didn't quite have time to talk about, third spaces. Basically, these three concepts together, if you think of Al Jazeera taking that fruit seller's story in Tunisia, following it across the Arab world, and following the revolts that then happened in Yemen, Libya, Syria, Bahrain, and so on, those three together actually feed into a dynamic together, which is something which we today call the Arab Spring. Again, these sorts of concepts, you think of the new Chinese Silk Road idea. The Chinese Silk Road idea essentially has been floated as a state-to-state concept, state-to-state platform. But if you think of China moving west, whenever China moves west, it has to go through Central Asia or the Indian Ocean. These are basically the intermediate spaces where you have Muslim populations. And these Muslim populations historically have been intermediaries in this long-distance trade, but as networks, as diasporic merchant networks. So our concepts help us to think about the new Chinese Silk Road, not in terms of state-to-state, but state in relation to these sorts of networks. These sorts of networks can be Gujarati Banya merchants who are happy to play ball, or they can be Wahhabis and Salafis and Marxists in places like Bangladesh who are happy to wreck the whole thing. So I think, in that sense, we were quite happy with our workshop in terms of trying to elicit concepts which, as it turns out, a year later, 3 years later, we find quite useful in thinking about these new things like the Arab Spring, the Chinese Silk Road, these very dynamic things which are happening today. And I'll end by saying that for myself personally, the Chinese Silk Road, the Arab Spring, the two of them together amount to what to me is actually a dialogue between East Asia or West Asia, or can be curated in that way. I am now part of me in Singapore, part of me is involved with the Asia Research Institute, and part of me will be involved with the Middle East Institute. And Prasenjit Dwara has talked about convergent comparison. Lisa Yoniyama talked about relative comparisons. I think these are excellent concepts, and I think that we also need a whole range of other concepts. I'll just mention the mobility, unbundling of citizenship, third spaces, circulation, outside in, internal, external engagement. And it is with this new range of concepts, rather than race, class, gender, and so on, that I think give us the traction to dig in to the existing old historical data which we have not properly mobilized, and at the same time use those concepts to chart how we think about these very dynamic things happening today. Thank you.